November 18, 1942. The city of Stalingrad. On the banks of the Volga River. At the headquarters of the German 6th Army located at Gumrak Airfield. General Friedrich Paulus was studying his situation map with a weariness that had settled into his bones over months of brutal urban combat, but beneath that exhaustion, there remained a bedrock of professional confidence. Under his command sat the most elite fighting force the Wehrmacht had deployed on the Eastern Front, 20 German divisions, 2 Romanian divisions, and a constellation of supporting units totaling more than 300,000 men. The 6th Army had earned a reputation that preceded it like thunder before a storm, the conqueror of Europe. These were the men who had paraded through Paris, crushed Poland, and driven thousands of kilometers into the Soviet heartland. Here at Stalingrad, they had seized 90% of the city after months of savage house-to-house, room-to-room fighting that had reduced entire city blocks to rubble. Paulus believed final victory was simply a matter of time. He had faith in his firepower. Thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of panzer tanks were trained on the last pockets of Soviet resistance clinging to the western bank of the Volga. He was convinced the Russians were exhausted, incapable of mounting any large-scale counteroffensive. Intelligence reports from foreign armies east, the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front Intelligence Bureau, confirmed that the Soviet Union had depleted its strategic reserves. However, Paulus and the German High Command had committed a fatal strategic error in their force disposition. The 6th Army had concentrated its entire striking power into the narrow spearhead driving through downtown Stalingrad, leaving both flanks, left and right, protected by weaker allied formations. The northern flank was held by the Romanian 3rd Army. The southern flank was covered by the Romanian 4th Army. These Romanian units were desperately short of anti-tank equipment. Their primary anti-tank weapon was the obsolete 37mm Pak-36, which German soldiers had long ago nicknamed the door knocker because it could do little more than scratch the paint on a Soviet T-34 tank. The Romanians had repeatedly requested modern 75mm Pak-40 guns. But German command always prioritized its own divisions. Romanian logistics were equally dismal, soldiers lacked winter clothing. Rations were poor. And morale had eroded steadily. These men did not understand why they should die in a frozen wasteland thousands of miles from home to serve Hitler's ambitions. Paulus knew about this weakness. He had flagged it to his superiors multiple times. But Hitler and the OKH had brushed his concerns aside. Too intoxicated by the prospect of capturing Stalingrad to worry about exposed flanks. They were convinced the Russians lacked the strength to punch through any defensive line, even the weakest one. What they did not know was that on the other side of the front, a colossal plan codenamed Uranus was being prepared in absolute secrecy. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky had quietly assembled more than 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, and 900 tanks on both flanks of the German position. They moved at night, camouflaged meticulously, and maintained total radio silence. They had deceived the German intelligence network with spectacular success. Zhukov's plan was not to attack the powerful 6th Army head-on. He would strike at the weakest links, the Romanians. He would drive 2 enormous pincers deep into the German rear, meeting at the town of Kalach on the Don River, and lock 300,000 German soldiers inside a pocket with no way out. On the night of November 18, heavy snow began falling. Temperatures dropped below -5 degrees Celsius. Fog blanketed the Don steppe. For Paulus, the bad weather was an inconvenience because it grounded the Luftwaffe. For Zhukov, it was the perfect curtain. Paulus went to sleep that night believing tomorrow would be another ordinary day of mopping up the last Russian holdouts in the city. He did not know that thousands of Soviet gun barrels were being elevated at that very moment, aimed directly at the Romanian positions on both of his flanks. The illusion of the 6th Army's invincibility was about to be crushed by a brutal strategic reality. An army, no matter how powerful, will die if its supply lines are severed and its weakest points are struck with overwhelming force. You're watching Combat Files on the War World 2 Dossiers-Podcast channel. Tactical analysis videos published daily at 11 a.m. Hit subscribe and like to follow the next developments of this historic battle. To understand the rapid collapse of both flanks of the Sixth Army, we need to examine the force structure of the Axis powers on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1942. The German army, after the Barbarossa campaign of 1941, had been stretched far beyond its limits across a front line running 3,000 kilometers from the Arctic to the Black Sea. To fill the gaps, Hitler was forced to rely on the armies of allied nations, Romania, Italy, and Hungary. In theory, these were valuable supporting forces. In practice, they were liabilities. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northwestern flank of Stalingrad, fielded roughly 150,000 men. But their equipment was a catastrophe. They lacked heavy artillery, lacked machine guns in adequate numbers, and most critically lacked any modern anti-tank capability. Their 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank guns were so ineffective against the T-34 that German soldiers had long since given them the contemptuous nickname door knockers, because a round from a Pak-36 would bounce off a T-34's sloped armor the way a polite visitor's knuckles bounce off a front door. The Romanians had begged for German 75mm Pak-40 guns repeatedly. But German command always prioritized its own formations. Romanian logistics were equally wretched, soldiers lacked winter clothing, rations were thin, and morale had been hollowed out over months of thankless garrison duty in a frozen country that was not theirs, fighting a war that was not theirs, for a leader they had not chosen. On the Soviet side, the Red Army of late 1942 had absorbed the brutal lessons of 1941 and was no longer the disorganized mass that had staggered backward under Barbarossa. Under Zhirkov's direction, Soviet planners had adopted the doctrine of deep operations, a sophisticated framework emphasizing the use of concentrated artillery to shatter the first defensive line, followed immediately by the commitment of mobile tank corps into the breach to drive deep into the enemy rear, severing retreat routes and supply lines before the defender could react. The morning of November 19, 1942, 7:20 a.m., Operation Uranus began with a display of firepower that shook the frozen earth of the Don steppe. 3,500 guns and heavy mortars of the southwestern front opened fire simultaneously against the Romanian positions. The sound rolled across the plain like continuous thunder that never faded. In the dense fog, Romanian soldiers could not see their enemy. They could only feel hell descending on them from every direction. Communication trenches collapsed. Artillery pieces were smashed. The entire command network was severed within minutes. After 80 minutes of sustained bombardment, Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks began their advance. They emerged from the white fog like iron ghosts, their wide tracks grinding through snow and frozen mud with a sound that Romanian survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. The Romanian infantry attempted to resist. They fired their 37mm guns at the oncoming tanks. The rounds bounced off harmlessly, sparking against the sloped armor like striking a match against stone. When the crews realized their weapons were useless, that they were firing what amounted to pebbles at advancing steel, panic took hold. They began to run. The defensive line shattered. Thousands of Romanian soldiers surrendered or were crushed beneath Soviet tank tracks. A gap 15 kilometers wide was torn open on Paulus's northern flank. At the Gumrak headquarters, Paulus received fragmented and increasingly panicked reports. Initially he believed this was a localized attack, a strong probe, perhaps, but nothing that couldn't be contained. He dispatched the 14th and 22nd Panzer Divisions to seal the breach. But these units had already been dispersed across multiple secondary missions and were critically short of fuel. By the time they reached the breakthrough sector, they collided with an entire Soviet tank army operating at full strength and full momentum. The German panzers, accustomed to dominating every battlefield they entered, found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. They were picked off one by one. On November 20 the second Soviet pincer snapped shut from the south. The Stalingrad front attacked the Romanian Fourth Army and the script repeated itself with mechanical precision, devastating artillery preparation, armored breakthrough, and the rapid disintegration of the defending force. Two enormous steel jaws were now racing toward each other across the frozen steppe at dizzying speed. Their meeting point was the bridge at Kalach on the Don River, the sole lifeline connecting the Sixth Army to its rear supply base. Paulus felt the cold run down his spine. He was beginning to understand that he was no longer the besieger of Stalingrad. He was becoming the besieged. The decisive variable in Operation Uranus was not simply the brilliance of the encirclement itself. It was Soviet industrial and logistical capacity. While the Germans were struggling with supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory, the Soviets had secretly built a field railway network almost up to the front. They had moved 1 million men and thousands of tanks into assembly areas without detection. At the heart of that industrial achievement stood the T-34. It was not elegant. It was not refined. But it was brutally effective. Designed for simplicity, mass production, and battlefield survivability. The T-34 could be built in enormous numbers and repaired under primitive conditions. Its wide tracks allowed it to move through snow and mud where German armor often bogged down. Its diesel engine performed reliably in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius, while German gasoline engines frequently failed in the cold. At the tank factories in Chelyabinsk and at Uralvagonzavod, Soviet workers, including women and children, labored in 3 non-stop shifts. For every German tank destroyed, multiple new T-34s were already moving down the line. Paulus's Sixth Army, by contrast, was entering the crisis with a severe fuel shortage. The reserve fuel depots had already been drained by months of urban combat. German tanks were being immobilized or dug into the ground as fixed pillboxes because there simply was not enough gasoline to maneuver them. When the Soviet pincers began closing, Paulus needed mobility to break out. He did not have the fuel to do it. On November 23, 1942 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Soviet armored units from the Southwestern Front and the Stalingrad Front linked up at Kalach. Men embraced on the bridge over the Don, shouting in victory as they sealed the pocket. The ring had closed. Inside this giant Kessel sat 22 German divisions, roughly 300,000 men, along with thousands of artillery pieces, trucks, horses, and vehicles. It was the largest military force ever encircled in modern warfare up to that point. Paulus sent an urgent message to Berlin: the army is completely surrounded. Request immediate permission to break out to the west. If he had acted in that moment, there was still a chance. The outer shell of the Soviet encirclement was still thin. With the remaining striking power of 20 German divisions, he might still have punched a hole and escaped. But Hitler intervened. From the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Führer sent back a cold, absolute order: no retreat. Hold fast. The army will be supplied by air. That promise rested on the assurance of Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring, vain, theatrical, and detached from reality, guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day into the pocket, enough, he claimed, to keep the encircled army alive and fighting. It was a catastrophic industrial miscalculation. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport aircraft. It did not have enough fuel. The winter weather over southern Russia made flying hazardous even in ideal circumstances. And the airfields inside the pocket, Gumrak and Pitomnik, were under constant Soviet artillery fire and frequently lost under fog or snow. Göring's promise became a death sentence for 300,000 men. Instead of attempting a breakout while movement was still possible, the Sixth Army was ordered to stay where it was and starve. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, life deteriorated into hell with astonishing speed. Death came from every direction. But the most terrifying enemies were not Soviet shells. They were cold and hunger. Temperatures fell to -30. German soldiers had no proper winter clothing. They wrapped themselves in newspapers, rags, blankets, anything they could find. Some stripped clothing from corpses to survive another night. Frostbite spread everywhere. Toes and fingers turned purple, then black. Army doctors amputated limbs without anesthesia. Food rations were cut again and again. First 300 grams of bread per day. Then 100. Then 50. At the end, men were living on bowls of thin soup made from horse bones and scraps of moss. The Germans slaughtered their artillery horses for meat. When the horses were gone, they trapped rats. When the rats were gone, men searched the belongings of the dead for crumbs of stale bread. The human body began consuming itself. Muscles wasted away. Fat reserves disappeared. Immune systems collapsed. Typhus and dysentery spread rapidly through filthy, overcrowded dugouts. Paulus watched the destruction of his army in slow motion. And he understood, day by day, that the Sixth Army was no longer a fighting force. It was becoming a death camp in uniform. Outside the pocket, the Soviet noose tightened with methodical patience. The Red Army did not rush to deliver the killing blow. They applied the doctrine of strangulation. Artillery pounded the airfields continuously, disrupting the air bridge that was the pocket's only connection to survival. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast mournful music and surrender appeals in German across the frozen lines, punctuated by the slow ticking of a metronome and a recorded voice repeating the same phrase at measured intervals. Every 7 seconds another German soldier dies in Russia. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective because every man inside the pocket knew it was true. Göring's air bridge was collapsing under the weight of its own impossibility. On average, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver roughly 90 tons of supplies per day, less than 1/5 of the minimum requirement. Transport aircraft were being shot down by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns at an unsustainable rate. Air crews flying the route called it the Death Corridor. Some supply drops missed the pocket entirely and landed in Soviet-held territory. In one infamous delivery that became a bitter legend among the starving troops, a parachute crate was recovered containing nothing but crates of ground pepper and boxes of condoms. Men who had not eaten in days stared at the contents in disbelief. December ground on. The last flicker of external hope was extinguished when Field Marshal Monstein's relief operation, codenamed Winter Storm, was halted 48 kilometers short of the pocket. Paulus could hear the distant thunder of Monstein's guns echoing across the steppe. Salvation was tantalizingly close. But he did not have enough fuel to move his tanks out to link up with the rescue force. The breakout window closed and would never reopen. Paulus understood now with absolute clarity that he had been abandoned. The Sixth Army was no longer a military formation in any meaningful sense. It was a vast open-air death camp wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. January 1943. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final liquidation of the pocket. General Rokossovsky, commanding the operation, sent an ultimatum to Paulus offering honorable surrender terms, guaranteeing the safety of all prisoners, providing food, medical treatment, and the right to retain personal belongings and decorations. Paulus forwarded the ultimatum to Berlin. Hitler's reply was immediate and absolute: no surrender. The Sixth Army must fight to the last bullet as an example for German history. Paulus obeyed. But it was the order of a madman imposed upon men already dying. On January 10 the Soviet assault began in earnest. This was no longer probing or testing. It was a firestorm. 7,000 artillery pieces concentrated their fire onto a shrinking perimeter. T-34 tanks rolled over defensive positions that German soldiers no longer had the ammunition or the strength to hold. The Germans fought with the desperation of cornered animals. They were not fighting for Hitler anymore. They were fighting because Goebbels' propaganda machine had hammered into their heads that Soviet captivity meant torture and death, that surrender was worse than the grave. But resistance crumbled rapidly because the fundamental inputs of warfare had run dry. The 88mm guns, the backbone of German anti-tank defense, fell silent when their ammunition was exhausted. Tanks without fuel sat immobile in the snow. Useless steel monuments to a logistics system that had failed completely. The last functioning airfield at Gumrak was overrun on January 23. The air bridge was severed permanently. Wounded soldiers who had been laid out on the runway waiting for evacuation flights that would never come were either crushed by advancing Soviet tanks or froze to death where they lay. Paulus relocated his headquarters into the basement of the Wehrmacht department store in the center of Stalingrad. He existed in darkness, in damp, in the stench of gangrene and unwashed bodies. He commanded nothing. His army corps had been split into two isolated pockets, a northern pocket and a southern pocket, each fighting its own separate hopeless battle without coordination or mutual support. The man who had led the conquerors of Europe was now sitting in a cellar, listening to the sound of Soviet tanks grinding through the rubble above his head, waiting for an ending that everyone except Hitler could see was inevitable. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hermann Göring delivered a radio address to the German nation. Speaking in the grandiose tone that came naturally to him, he compared the soldiers of Stalingrad to the Spartan warriors at Thermopylae, men who chose death over dishonor, who stood fast against impossible odds and became immortal through sacrifice. German soldiers huddled in their frozen dugouts listened to the broadcast on failing radio sets. They did not feel immortal. They felt abandoned. They felt used. They understood with nauseating clarity that they were being sacrificed not for Germany but for a propaganda narrative, that their deaths were being stage-managed from Berlin to serve a political purpose that had nothing to do with their survival. The revulsion was universal and silent. On January 31 Hitler made one final gesture. He promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The implicit message was as clear as a pistol laid on a desk. In the entire history of the German and Prussian military tradition, no field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to put a bullet in his own head and enter the pantheon of Germanic warrior mythology. Paulus received the promotion telegram and read it without expression. He turned to his staff officers in the dim basement of the Wehrmacht and said quietly, "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal." The morning of January 31, 1943. Soviet troops surrounded the Wehrmacht department store. T-34 tanks trained their guns on the main entrance. A group of Soviet officers descended into the basement. They picked their way through piles of refuse, blood-soaked bandages, and frozen corpses stacked against the walls. The smell was overpowering, the concentrated stench of death and disease and human waste that had accumulated over weeks in an enclosed underground space without ventilation or sanitation. In the last room at the end of a narrow corridor, they found Friedrich Paulus. The newest field marshal of the Third Reich was lying on an iron cot, his face gaunt and hollowed by dysentery, his cheeks covered in days of stubble. He wore no insignia of rank. He carried no weapon. He stood slowly, his body trembling from cold and illness, and offered a salute that was more reflex than conviction. He announced his surrender. Simultaneously in Berlin, Hitler received the news and erupted in fury. He cursed Paulus as a traitor and a coward. He raged that a field marshal should have chosen death, that the act of surrender had dishonored every soldier who had fought and died at Stalingrad. He declared that he would never again promote anyone to that rank. But Hitler's anger changed nothing on the ground. 91,000 German soldiers, the skeletal remnant of a force that had once numbered 300,000, laid down their weapons. They emerged from basements and bunkers and dugouts, forming endless columns on the snow-covered streets. They did not look like soldiers. They did not look like the conquerors of Europe. They looked like ghosts. Uniforms in rags, feet wrapped in strips of cloth, eyes sunk deep into skulls, faces the color of old wax. The march to the prisoner of war camps in Siberia became the next chapter of suffering. Thousands died on the journey from exhaustion, exposure, disease, and starvation. The camps themselves were places of slow death. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, only approximately 5,000 would survive to return to Germany. The last of them came home in 1955, more than a decade after the war had ended. They returned to a country that had been rebuilt, to families that had mourned them and moved on, to a world that had changed beyond recognition. They carried with them memories that no amount of time could erase: the sound of Soviet artillery, the smell of the Wehrmacht basement, the faces of comrades who had died in the snow. Stalingrad had consumed them and then released the survivors as broken men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of what they had endured. The collapse of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad sent a psychological shockwave through the German nation that no amount of propaganda could absorb. For the first time since the war began, ordinary German citizens confronted the possibility that they might lose. The images of German soldiers surrendering, hands raised, shuffling through the ruins of a city they had been told was virtually conquered, became the defining visual symbol of Nazi failure. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Radio stations played solemn music. Flags flew at half-mast. But beneath the choreographed grief, something far more dangerous to the regime was taking root: doubt. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not merely a military triumph. It was the vindication of an entire industrial and organizational system. The Soviet Union had demonstrated a capacity for recovery that defied every assumption the Germans had made about their enemy. After the catastrophic defeats of 1941, when entire Soviet army groups had been encircled and destroyed, when millions of soldiers had been killed or captured, and when the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow, the Soviet leadership had made a decision of staggering ambition. They would physically relocate their entire industrial base eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, and rebuild it from nothing in the middle of the Siberian winter. More than 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto railway cars, transported thousands of kilometers east, and reassembled in new locations. Workers lived in tents and unheated barracks while they rebuilt production lines. Within months, tanks and aircraft and artillery pieces were rolling off assembly lines in cities that had been empty fields a year before. The Soviet weapons production philosophy was built on a principle that stood in direct opposition to the German approach: simplicity and quantity over refinement and quality. They did not attempt to build perfect weapons. They built weapons that were good enough to kill the enemy and simple enough to be manufactured by the thousands. The T-34 was the supreme expression of this philosophy. It was crude by German engineering standards. The interior finish was rough. The crew ergonomics were poor. But it worked. It started in the cold. It ran through the mud. It absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. And it came off the production line in numbers that the German industrial system could never hope to match. Soviet logistics at Stalingrad also passed an extraordinary test. Supplying over 1 million troops across the frozen Volga River under constant German artillery fire was an achievement that deserves recognition alongside any feat of military engineering in history. They used icebreakers when the river was partially frozen, trucks when it was fully frozen, ferries and barges when it was open water, and human muscle when nothing else was available. The flow of ammunition and food never stopped completely. Even in the darkest weeks, the German system by contrast had collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity and arrogance. Hitler's compulsive interference in tactical decisions had stripped front-line commanders of the flexibility that had once made the Wehrmacht the most adaptive fighting force in the world. His standing orders prohibited retreat and prohibited maneuver, transforming a mobile army into a collection of fixed targets. The German railway system, which functioned superbly in Western Europe where distances were short and infrastructure was excellent, had been paralyzed by the vast distances of Russia and the difference in rail gauge between German and Soviet track. Supply trains had to stop at the old border. their cargo transferred to different rolling stock before continuing east, a bottleneck that consumed time and resources the German logistical system could not afford. Most critically, German industry could not replace what Stalingrad had consumed. The loss of 20 elite divisions with all their equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, small arms, communications gear, engineering equipment, created a hole in the Wehrmacht's force structure that would never be filled. The factories back in Germany were already running at capacity. There was no surge production available. Every tank lost at Stalingrad was a tank that would not be defending the Rhine 2 years later. After Stalingrad, the German army permanently lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The long retreat had begun, a retreat that would not end until Soviet tanks were parked in the ruins of Berlin. February 1943. Stalingrad fell quiet again. The city that had once been home to 500,000 people was now nothing more than an immense field of rubble. 99% of its buildings had been destroyed completely. Not damaged. Destroyed. The corpses of German and Soviet soldiers lay scattered everywhere, frozen solid in the snow in whatever position death had found them, some crouching behind walls that no longer existed, some reaching for weapons they would never fire, some curled into themselves as though trying to stay warm in a cold that no longer mattered. When spring arrived and the snow melted, the smell of decomposition rose from the ruins with such intensity that Soviet authorities were forced to mobilize thousands of civilians to collect and bury the dead. The hills surrounding the city, particularly Mamayev Kurgan, the strategic height that had changed hands more than a dozen times during the battle, became enormous mass graves. The soil on that hill was so saturated with iron fragments and explosive residue that grass refused to grow there for years afterward. Friedrich Paulus survived captivity. After the war he appeared as a witness at the Nuremberg trials, testifying against the Nazi regime he had served. He spent the remainder of his life in East Germany and died in 1957. He never forgave Hitler for abandoning him and his men. But he also never forgave himself for lacking the courage to disobey orders and attempt the breakout that might have saved 300,000 lives. That failure haunted him until his last breath. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as the single most important turning point of the Second World War. It did not merely break the spine of the German army on the Eastern Front. It fundamentally altered the geopolitical architecture of the world. It proved that military power does not reside solely in superior weapons or brilliant tactics. It resides in endurance, in industrial depth, and in the unity of a nation fighting for its survival. The Red Army did not win at Stalingrad because it had better guns. It won because it had an iron will and an industrial base that could absorb catastrophic losses and keep producing. It had transformed suffering into strength and scarcity into innovation. For military professionals, Stalingrad remains the textbook case study in the art of strategic encirclement. Operation Uranus is taught at war colleges around the world as a model of combined arms maneuver warfare, the precise integration of deception, artillery concentration, armored exploitation, and logistical sustainment into a single devastating operational sequence. It is also an enduring warning about the danger of underestimating an adversary. Hitler and his generals held the Russian people in racial contempt, dismissing them as subhuman and incapable of sophisticated military thought. That arrogance led them to ignore the warning signs accumulating on both flanks of the Sixth Army. It led them to stake everything on the capture of a single city while leaving the door open for their own destruction. The price of that arrogance was paid not by Hitler in his bunker but by 300,000 ordinary soldiers freezing and starving in the ruins of a city most of them had never heard of before the war. Today the city of Stalingrad has been renamed Volgograd. On the summit of Mamayev Kurgan stands the Motherland Calls, one of the largest statues on earth. A towering female figure with sword raised, gazing down over the Volga. At the base of the monument burns an eternal flame that has never been extinguished. Day or night, summer or winter, since it was first lit. Beneath the manicured grass of the memorial park lie the remains of tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides who never received individual graves. When you walk across that ground today, you are walking on bones. Stalingrad is not simply a place name on a map. It is a symbol of sacrifice, of courage, of the unforgivable cruelty of war, and of the terrible price that ordinary human beings pay when political ambition overrides human decency. The silence of that memorial hill is the most eloquent argument for peace that history has ever produced. Thank you for watching this combat file on the World War II Dossiers-Podcast channel. If this account of Field Marshal Paulus and the destruction of the 6th Army at Stalingrad gave you a new perspective on military history, please hit like and subscribe to support our work. We are committed to bringing you the forgotten stories of history, not through the lens of triumphant victors but through the eyes of the defeated in the moment they realized that courage alone cannot overcome industrial scale. Where are you watching from today? And do you know of other legendary sieges and encirclements from military history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement is what drives us to keep exploring the secrets of the past. We will see you in the next story, about the people, the machines, and the moments that shaped the world we live in today.